So my name is Gary Giles II. I teach at Monterey High School. I teach several classes including ELD, English 1 Honors, and an expository reading and writing course. And I am honored to be a 2016 recipient of the Carlson Family Foundation Award. That question is pretty easy. So when I was 8 years old, in 1969, I had a chance to sit in my dad's classroom. And he was teaching at a Monte Vista Elementary School, and he was teaching a 6th grade core class. This was in Monterey. And so I was 8 years old, so I was very young, but I noticed several things were happening while I was there. And students were engaged. They were working in groups before we called them collaborative. Oftentimes there was healthy laughter and lots of smiles, and the students seemed to be participating willfully and willingly, without shame and without any sort of fear of any kind of language or anything like that. And so when I think about his classroom and the way he conducted the classroom and the fact that there was so much student engagement and there was a lot of he expected high expectations for students and they excelled in his classroom, that resonated with me, and that's essentially why I'm here today. Well, I think the greatest reward for me is seeing my students come back as adults and come into my room and share whatever they're doing professionally. It could also be what's happening in their life personally. If they're newly married and they have children, and they talk to me about having made a difference, and whether it was just like believing in them, realizing that they could reach their full expectations, letting them know that if they wanted to work in a trade, if they wanted to do something else that didn't necessarily mean they were going to college, that was absolutely fine and should be embraced. And so when they come back and talk to me about their success, whether they're going to college or they're working professionally, I take great pride in the fact that they come back and they share that with me, and in some way impart that I had some influence on that, because at the end of the day, I just believed in them. On most days, I try to make connections with them as much as I can. And even at my particular school, we have class sizes that are in excess of 35 to 40 students, and that can be a daunting task. So at least every other day, I'm mindful of the need to make connections with them individually. And that may look in all sorts of ways. For instance, I'll hand out papers and I'll go row by row, and I'll check in with as many students as I can. I might ask them how their football game went, or what book have you read recently, or they might be wearing a shirt with some new band on that I don't know, and we'll have a conversation about that. So I make that's an approach that I use at least every other day. It takes a little time, but that's the way that I can create a nurturing environment where I feel like my students feel safe. Beyond that, I sit with my students a lot. Like when we work in groups, I'm rarely at my desk. I try to make sure that I'm sitting in. I'm not really monitoring, I'm just sitting in, I'm just participating. And sometimes helping to facilitate, but I'm just really there to be present and support them. And I try to get around to my students as much as possible. And that for me has worked really well. Because I'm a facilitator and I'm with them. I'm not at my desk, I'm sort of in the field, and I'm sort of exchanging ideas merely as a participant. And my dad also taught me this one, and it's essential that you catch them being good, right? You catch them when they're doing something well, or when they're behaving well. That's when you celebrate it. Well, so recently my sophomores just finished reading 1984, and that's a challenging text. It's daunting, it's long, and today a lot of students don't necessarily have the habits to read an entire text. So you have to navigate that by introducing things that are relevant to them. So one of the themes in 1984 is the intrusion of technology, and it's all the way around us. And so my students were struggling with that initially, but when I started to ask them, usually in collaborative groups, to think about ways that technology is influencing your lives in ways that maybe aren't healthy, they started to come up with all sorts of things, including WikiLeaks, to a new term I'd never heard about called catfishing, which is when you put a different social media profile to try to gain interest, and how that's just sort of an interesting use of technology. That's not necessarily what we want people to do, but they came into that on their own. So that would, with challenging text, and if they can make those connections, then they're a little bit more curious about what's in chapter 2. If you don't do that and make connections to the real world that they're experiencing today, the rest of the text becomes irrelevant, and it's just sort of a silly task. So I try to do that intermittently, bring in whatever's happening. We talk about the political world today. In 1984, we talk about propaganda and censorship, and what does that look like today, and then we can go back to the text, and it becomes a little bit more meaningful for them.